Unsolved cases are often very interesting, as we can speculate about what happened and who committed the crime when evidence is lacking to identify a suspect. Luckily, investigators often revisit these cases, some of which are decades old, and with advancements in technology and new investigative techniques, they're finally able to bring closure to those involved. When a cold case is solved decades after the fact, there's usually a sense of relief as the victim's family can finally get some closure when a suspect is identified and arrested. But in some of these types of cases, the solving of the crime does little to bring them any comfort, which is what occurred in the case of 22-year-old Muriel Demarest. On the 21st of April, 1996, Muriel was found deceased in an alleyway in Regina, specifically in the 1200 block of King Street. She was in the process of changing a tire on her car when it was initially believed something went wrong and she ended up losing her life. The police were ready to close the case, believing that it was all an accident, but as the years went by, several people came forward with statements that made investigators believe otherwise. It's not been revealed what these statements were or how the witnesses were related to Muriel. But in 2025, the Regina Police Department decided to review her case and the statements made by witnesses. No further details on the actual investigation have been released, but it was then announced that a suspect had been identified. Their name has also not been released to the public, so it isn't known whether that person and Muriel knew each other, or whether the suspect happened upon her while she was busy changing the tire. It may have been a crime of opportunity or planned ahead of time, but since no further details have been or will be released, we will likely never know exactly what happened that day. Once the suspect was identified, efforts were made to track them down, but it was then discovered that they'd already passed away, and hence no one was ever charged with ending Muriel's life. The acting chief of the RPS did, though, reiterate that there are many unsolved cases all across the country, and anyone who has any information on those should come forward, since even the smallest piece of evidence could lead to its closure, as was evidenced by Muriel's case. Investigators also reiterated that they found no evidence that anyone else was involved, and so they do consider the case finally closed. They confirmed that the suspect lost their life before Muriel's case was even considered a homicide, and hence they never even came close to arresting anyone. In May of 1985, 18-year-old Christine Gallegos was supposed to report to work for a shift in Salt Lake City, and she was known to hitchhike back and forth, which was nowhere near as dangerous back then as it is today. But when she never arrived, she was reported missing, and an investigation ensued. The search for her ended in the worst possible way when she was found deceased on the 16th of May, the day after she disappeared, and the case was upgraded from a missing person investigation to a homicide. The witness, a motorist who was driving in the area of Ball Park, reported that he noticed something strange by the side of the road, and he decided to investigate. Upon closer inspection, he realized that he'd found a body, and he immediately informed the police. When the scene was processed, investigators concluded that Christine had been assaulted and then attacked with a sharpened blade, before then also being attacked with a firearm. It was also certain that she put up a brave fight, but was ultimately unable to fend off her attacker. The resulting investigation saw no progress, and for the next 40 years it gathered dust, and it seemed likely that Christine's attacker would get away with their heinous crime. Forensic testing was carried out on items found at the scene several times as years passed by, but no matches were ever found. The police knew that with every passing year, the case would become more difficult to solve, but they also knew that advancements were being made in the world of forensics, and they might be able to find the culprit in the future. The case was reviewed once again in 2023, and a few samples of DNA that were found at the scene were sent to be tested again. Othram Labs, a company based in Texas, carried out a new set of genealogy analysis, and this time they managed to find a match. The suspect was identified as Ricky Lee Stallworth, who was 27 years old at the time when the crime was committed. He was an airman who was stationed at Hill Air Base in Davis County, Utah, and he was never questioned after the attack, since he was never considered a suspect. At last, investigators and Christine's family had some answers, but unfortunately, many more questions remain. When efforts were made to trace Stallworth, it was discovered that he'd passed away from natural causes in 2023, and while the case had been solved, he'd passed away without ever paying for his deeds. It was never learned whether Christine and Stallworth knew each other, and if so, what the nature of their relationship was. It seemed as though Christine's remaining family had no knowledge of him, and hence it's likely that he ended her life in a crime of opportunity. But it was revealed that Stallworth was in the habit of interacting with street workers in 2022 and 2023, especially in the area of State Street, and hence he was known to the police, but never linked to Christine's case. Investigators stated he was a married man who would sneak out of his family's house late at night when he knew everyone in the house was asleep, and he would then drive down State Street looking for street workers to pick up. He would return to the house before anyone woke up, and he never told his wife what he'd been doing. One of his children decided to provide investigators with a DNA sample, and when it was compared to Stallworth's, it came back as a match, and the case was finally solved 40 years after the attack took place. Some cold cases are never solved, despite a lot of evidence being found, since that evidence can never be tied to any specific individual. But in some cases, the smallest amount of evidence eventually leads to a suspect being identified and arrested, as was the case during a reinvestigation of the murder of Janette Rston. In 1977, Janette was a 24-year-old woman living in San Mateo, California, and on the 31st of January that year, she was seen in the Lion's Den bar. According to the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, she suddenly disappeared after leaving the establishment. Witnesses described seeing her exiting the bar just before midnight that night, and she was in the company of a man whom no one there recognized. The next morning, Janette was found deceased in the parking lot of a nearby complex, still sitting in her Volkswagen Beetle. When the scene was processed, it was discovered that her attacker had attempted to set fire to the car, but was unsuccessful. This would have gotten rid of most, if not all, of the evidence at the scene, but several clues were discovered. It was determined that Janette's life was ended with the use of a long-sleeved shirt that was found around her neck, and this, coupled with witness statements from the bar and the attempt to set the car alight, seemed like enough to start the investigation. But these clues led nowhere, and before long the case went cold. For the next 47 years, no suspect was identified, and no further clues were found. It was only in 2024 that cold case detectives were able to take another look at the case, and this time, they found something useful. When the scene was processed the first time, investigators removed a packet of Eve's cigarettes from the car, and Janette's friends confirmed that this was her preferred brand. The packet was analyzed once more in 2024, and a set of fingerprints was discovered. When these were added to a database, they were found to be a match for 69-year-old Willie Eugene Sims, and he immediately became the prime suspect. When his history was checked, it was discovered that he was a private in the U.S. Army at the time of the attack. Furthermore, it was found that he spent time in prison just a year after Janette's life was ended, since he'd attacked someone else in Monterey County with the intent of also ending their life. After some more investigating, it was found that Sims was living in Ohio. Investigators tracked him down, and he provided a DNA sample, which was found to be a match for DNA found under Janette's fingernails and on the shirt that was used to end her life. It was announced that Sims would be extradited to California, where he would stand trial, and if found guilty of the crime, he could face up to 25 years in prison, which would mean that he would only be released at the age of 94, though he may be incarcerated for the rest of his life. In June of 1986, 49-year-old Shirley Brandt was employed as a real estate broker at the Brandt Realty Corporation in North Miami Beach, and according to her son, Stephen, she was a very loving and kind person who had a talent for singing and used to perform on cruise ships with her sister during the 60s. The last time that he saw her was at the beginning of June 1986, and the family had dinner together at a restaurant in Gainesville. Shirley mentioned that her 50th birthday was coming up, and that she'd seen a birthday card that amused her since it read, "Being 50 is nifty." Her birthday was just 2 weeks away, but just a week later, she lost her life while at work in her office. On the 13th of June that year, Shirley was on the phone with a friend, according to her coworkers, when they suddenly heard her scream. They then heard her scream, and a temporary employee at the office then saw a man trying to take the phone away from her, while another man watched on. Shirley then shouted, "Don't shoot," but moments later a shot rang out and 2 men fled. The police were called, and when they arrived, Shirley was found unresponsive in her office. She was rushed to Parkway Regional Hospital, but sadly lost her life soon afterward. The witnesses stated that the 2 men were dressed in nice clothing, including dress pants and long-sleeved collared shirts. She believed that they were trying to blend in by dressing like professionals, but were really in the act of committing a robbery. The pair managed to flee with Shirley's credit cards and an unknown amount of money that was taken from her wallet. According to Shirley's family, she had 4 children at the time, and her husband Stephen, who's a local dentist, never managed to get over her passing. When the case went cold, he hired a private detective to investigate, but he was also unable to identify any suspects. The case went cold, and for decades, no more information was found. But in 2023, the North Miami Beach Police Department formed a cold case squad to review unsolved cases, one of which was Shirley's. 2 detectives who'd worked on the case in the 70s, and who'd since retired, were asked to assist once more, and they agreed. It was then discovered that a set of fingerprints that were found at the scene were never entered into the automated fingerprint identification system, since they didn't meet certain criteria at the time. These prints were sent for analysis, and a match was quickly found. It was determined that they belonged to 64-year-old Jeffrey Taylor, who was then tracked down and taken into custody. It's believed that Taylor was the man who struggled with Shirley that day, and that he was the one who fired that shot that ended her life. He was charged with second-degree murder with a firearm and is currently awaiting trial while being held at the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center. Imagine committing a crime and getting away with it for decades, only to be identified as the culprit much later on, and then finding out you'll need to go to prison when you're already elderly. This is exactly what happened in the case concerning 45-year-old Ivon Meny, who lost her life outside her house in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin in 1985. When the incident was reported, police officers arrived at the scene and found that she'd been attacked with a firearm and that her attacker had fled. Her boyfriend Jack Owen told investigators that he'd last seen Ivon at a party that they were attending a month earlier. He explained that they met at a horse show and that they started dating after realizing they both had a passion for the sport. From the very beginning of the investigation, it was suspected that Ivon's attacker knew her, since the attack was carried out from close range. This also led them to believe that it was a crime of passion, and that the attacker had an emotional motive for ending Ivon's life. When the area was searched, boot prints were found in the snow, and the imprint clearly showed that they had the word Arctic printed on the bottom of the heels. More of these same prints were found about a block away from Ivon's house. As the investigation progressed, a witness told the police that Owen wasn't dating Ivon, and that he was actually in a relationship with a woman named Mary Bailey. But he had, however, been seen at several horse shows in Ivon's company, rather than Mary's. When Mary was questioned, she stated she'd never spoken to Ivon, but admitted that she was aware that she and Owen would spend time together. But she soon confessed that she had called Ivon on one occasion. She stated that she merely wanted to talk to Ivon about her relationship with Owen, but it later came to light thanks to phone records that she had called Ivon on several occasions in 1985. A search confirmed that Mary owned the same type of firearm that was used in the attack, but this was not enough to prove that she was the attacker, and no charges could be brought against her. The boots and several other pieces of Mary's clothing were taken as evidence and processed, but the tests came back negative for biological material. The case stagnated, and before long it went cold with no arrests made. It would only be revisited in 2021, starting with re-interviewing the people who were close to Ivon, Mary, and Owen, who'd passed away by this point. One of Mary's friends revealed that she'd been keeping a secret since a year after the attack took place. She admitted that a man whom Mary was dating at the time approached her and asked her to burn some clothing that he had with him. He told her that Mary had asked him to approach her specifically, but when he was tracked down and questioned, he stated he had no memory of those events. Mary was living in Arizona by this point, and when she was questioned again, she told the same story, that she couldn't recall asking the man to do this. When asked why boot prints matching a pair that she owned were found at the crime scene, she was unable to provide an explanation. She was taken into custody and charged with ending Ivon's life, but she remained adamant that she was innocent. But this did little to sway the jury in her case, and she was sentenced to a mandatory life sentence at the age of 81. Before it was finally solved in 2025, the case of the murder of 18-year-old Lelle Wait, which took place in January of 1986, was the oldest cold case in Phoenix, Arizona. Lelle, who was better known to her family and friends as Shelley, had just graduated from Maryvale High School at the time, and she was working full-time. She also enjoyed dancing and singing in a local choir, but also spent her time tutoring students. Her family states that she was a beautiful person on the outside and inside, and that she had forged a path of success, which she never had the chance to take advantage of since her life was unexpectedly cut short. On the 16th of January, 1986, the police were informed that Shelley was found deceased inside her house, which was located close to 59th Avenue and Thomas Road in Phoenix. It was determined that someone had gained entry into the house and then ended her life. It was immediately believed that she knew her attacker, since there were no signs of forced entry, and hence it was likely that she let them into the house, never suspecting that they had any nefarious intentions. It was then discovered that some items had been stolen from the house, and it was suggested that they were taken to make the attack look like a robbery, or that someone close to her was desperate for money, and so targeted her house. Investigators stated at the time that they had a good lead to follow, but that they didn't have enough evidence to take anyone into custody. This never changed, and as time went by without any new evidence being found, the case went cold. It seemed as though Shelley's attacker would get away with their crime. Luckily, it was decided in 2016 that the case should undergo a review, and when the evidence that was collected at the scene was reviewed again, it was discovered that one item had never been processed in 1986. Investigators have stated that the item could not be processed at the time, but it didn't provide any further details. It later came to light that DNA technology had not advanced far enough for the evidence to point to any specific person. But in 2016, this was no longer the case. The item was sent for testing, and before long, a suspect was identified. 70-year-old Alfred Earl Green's DNA was present on the item, but it was then discovered that he'd been in prison for decades since he was found guilty of also ending someone else's life in Phoenix. For that crime, some sources stated he was sentenced to 25 years to life, but this is yet to be confirmed. At his trial, he stated that he stole jewelry and a firearm from Shelley's house that day, and then he sold them immediately after the attack. When asked to respond to the charges against him, Green simply stated, "I know she did a lot of lying," likely referring to Shelley, but it isn't clear what he meant by that statement. According to those in attendance, he seemed defeated as he stated he didn't care how high his bond would be. He's currently awaiting sentencing. Two crimes that have been solved in Kansas City after nearly 3 decades have led investigators to believe that Gary Dion Davis Sr. could be a serial killer, and that he may have ended the lives of several more people. During the 1990s, Davis was working as a long-haul truck driver, and hence didn't stay in one place for very long, giving him the perfect opportunity to carry out these crimes over the course of several years. The first crime that's been attributed to Davis occurred on the 22nd of November, 1996, when Pearl Barnes was found deceased inside a house in Kansas City. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade. 2 years later, on the 25th of December, 1995, 26-year-old Christina King was also found deceased behind an abandoned building, also in Kansas City. She'd been badly assaulted, resulting in the loss of her life. Evidence containing DNA was collected from these crime scenes, but for years, no suspect was identified, since the technology to do so didn't exist yet. But when the case was reviewed in 2023, progress was finally made. Davis's DNA was found on items from both crime scenes, and he was arrested. But investigators have speculated they may be involved in several other cases in which people were attacked and their lives ended. If so, he'll be classified as a serial killer, and only time will tell how many cases he'll be linked to. For now, he's been charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, but he'll likely face several more charges as the investigation progresses. When his social media profiles were checked, posts were discovered on his Facebook account in which he complained about the double standards that exist between men and women, and it's been suggested that this view may have been the motive for his crimes, though this has not been confirmed. It has been confirmed by media outlets, though, that investigators had revisited the case in 2003, and that DNA testing then showed that Davis was present at the attacks. At the time, though, no cold case squad had been created, and detectives in Kansas City didn't have the time to follow up on the case, since their workloads were too high. It's been confirmed that Davis's hearing will be held before a jury, and it's likely that he will face a sentence of life in prison if he's found guilty. He was last known to be held at the Wyandotte County Jail after a $500,000 bond was set. Almost 45 years after 25-year-old Susan Wolf's life was ended, investigators have managed to identify a suspect who's now been taken into custody. In 1980, Susan had enrolled at the University of Texas, where she was set to start her studies as a nursing student. On the 9th of January of that year, though, her life would be cut short by an unknown individual. That night, Susan was walking to a friend's house in Austin at around 10 p.m., but she never made it there. The police were contacted by a witness who stated that they saw a car pull up next to Susan, after which the driver quickly got out. They then grabbed Susan, forced her into the back of the vehicle, and sped off. They didn't recognize the driver, and the police were unable to track the car down. It would later be revealed that she would not have been walking on the street that night, were it not for the fact that her house was being fumigated. She was abducted just a block from her house, and the following morning, everyone's worst fears were confirmed, when Susan was found deceased in an alleyway in Austin. She'd been attacked with a firearm after being assaulted, and an investigation was immediately launched. While no one seemed to have a motive for the crime, several suspects were identified and questioned, but this was merely done because they fit the description of the attacker as provided by the only witness. Dozens of people were ruled out, but 6 were still considered suspects, but no further evidence was found, and they were eventually released. Little did they know that many years later, DNA evidence would clear those 6 people and identify a different man as the culprit. In 2023, the DNA collected at the crime scene was sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory, and experts were able to build a profile of Susan's attacker, but his identity remained unknown. The samples were then entered into the Combined DNA Index system, which searches through collected DNA from crime scenes, convicted criminals, and missing person cases. And shortly after, the results were returned, showing that a man named Deck Brewer Jr. was a match. He was tracked down and found to already be serving time in prison for an unrelated crime. And when he was questioned, he revealed that he was in the Austin area at the time that the attack was carried out. He's not admitted to the crime, but thanks to the DNA evidence, it's likely that he'll be found guilty of ending Susan's life, and hence he'll never see the outside world again, since he's now almost 80 years old. Efforts are being made to identify a second suspect as well, but in the meantime, Brewer will face a charge of capital murder more than 4 decades after the crime was committed, and it's unlikely that he'll provide investigators with any additional information regarding his supposed accomplice. Lelle Nuchek was just 3 years old when her mother, Magata Nuchek, suddenly disappeared from England in 2006, and in the years that have passed, she's grown ever more desperate to find out what happened to her. The rest of Magata's family has stated that they're certain someone knows something about her case, but that they've chosen to not come forward for reasons unknown. They told a media outlet that they have lived their lives in darkness since she disappeared, and that the stress of not knowing what happened to her has taken its toll on them. The last time that anyone had any contact with Magata was when she and her family texted each other on the 29th of May, 2006. After she was reported as missing, a witness reported seeing her board a bus from Peter Jackson Logistics, where she was employed, and that she was heading to the city center. But she was never seen again, and investigators have revealed that they believe at least one person in the area has information on the case that they failed to report. After an investigation was started, the Leicester police and Polish police have remained in contact with each other and Magata's family. But despite everything possible being done, she was never found. When news of her disappearance broke, more than 2,000 people contacted the police with possible leads, all of which were followed up on, but failed to lead to any positive progress in the case. Then, in 2023, Polish investigators contacted the Leicester Police Department and prompted them to carry out a search of the River Soar, though it's not been revealed what led them to make this suggestion. In June of that year, the search was carried out, and several items were found on the riverbed with the use of sonar equipment. But investigators were unable to identify these items, and specialist divers were brought in to continue searching in the river itself. In October of that year, more searches of the river were conducted, but it isn't known whether any additional items were collected. But it has been revealed that a 39-year-old man hailing from the Greater Manchester area was taken into custody, but his name has not been released to the public. It's unlikely that he's the main suspect in Magata's disappearance, since investigators stated that he's suspected of aiding an offender and perverting the course of justice. This has led many people to believe that Magata's life was ended by someone, and that the arrested man then helped them get rid of evidence, though this has not been confirmed. Investigators have asked that anyone in the Leicester community with additional information come forward, since it's very likely that someone traveling on the bus that day may have seen something or a suspicious person before Magata vanished without a trace. If you have any information that may be useful, you're asked to contact the police by dialing 101 or visiting the UK police website, quoting Incident 362 of the 2nd of June 2023. In 2007, 53-year-old James Johansson was living in Lewisburg, Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and he was in the process of selling several cars. It was known that he'd traveled to Fairleigh, also in West Virginia, where he sold one of his cars to a private resident, but then he inexplicably disappeared. When he failed to return home as planned, he was reported as missing, and investigators traveled to Fairleigh to interview the last person he was known to have had contact with. The buyer of the car stated that James sold him a car and then left in the company of an unknown woman. It was known that he was planning to travel to Ohio after that to buy a new car, but he disappeared before this could be done. The person that he was supposed to meet was identified and questioned, but they stated that James never arrived for their meeting and that they never heard from him again. James's family became ever more concerned for his well-being when he failed to contact them, but no further leads were received, and before long the case went cold. No one had any idea what had become of James, or who the woman was that he was seen with. Then, in September of 2021, investigators revealed that they'd searched and excavated an area near Muddy Creek and Mountain in West Virginia, and they came across a set of human remains. The remains were sent for analysis, and a short while later they were confirmed to belong to James. Investigators also added that they were able to collect additional evidence at the site, and that they were following leads that came to light thanks to this discovery. While it never was revealed what evidence was collected, it's known that it pointed to a certain man, Charles Michael Kaysen Kessinger, who was living in San Antonio in 2022. He was tracked down at his house, and West Virginia state investigators, along with Texas Rangers and Texas Department of Safety, surrounded the building before he was taken into custody. It's not been revealed whether James and Kessinger knew each other, or whether the crime had anything to do with the sale of James's vehicles, but Kessinger was transported to a southern regional jail in West Virginia, where he was pending trial. No further details have been made available, but investigators have stated that Kessinger was charged with first-degree murder and robbery. This came after a report was compiled using the reports and tips that were received over the years. The report was then submitted to a grand jury, who ordered that Kessinger should be arrested and charged. One investigator is quoted as saying the robbery and the allegation of murder were a result of a singular transaction of events between these two individuals, suggesting that James and Kessinger either knew each other or had arranged to meet. It's believed that the motive for the crime was that Kessinger wanted to steal James's car, a 1995 Dodge Neon, and they ended his life in order to take possession of the vehicle. The investigator also stated that Kessinger was likely one of the people who were interviewed in the wake of James's disappearance, and that he wasn't identified as a suspect back then, since the case was being treated as a missing person investigation and not a homicide. Following the interviews and the case going cold, Kessinger moved to Texas, where he was eventually tracked down and arrested. No further information is available on his sentence, and hence it's believed that his trial is still pending 3 years after he was arrested, though this has not been confirmed. In 2019, genetic genealogy solved a cold case mystery for the first time. Since then, countless crimes that would have otherwise gone unsolved have been closed due to the technology. In February of 2025, police in Arkansas were able to add the identity of the Lonoke County John Doe to the list of mysteries solved by the technology. The mystery began in 1984. It was the day before Halloween, and workers for the Arkansas Department of Transportation were cutting grass along Interstate 40. As they cleared an area between Lonoke and Carlisle, they discovered the body of a man lying face down in a ditch. The man had his hands tied with a cord and a piece of wire wrapped around his neck. It's not clear how long the man had been in the ditch for, but his record in NamUs states that the state of his remains was unrecognizable. What was obvious was that the man had met with foul play, and the autopsy confirmed that the wire around his neck is what claimed his life. The police investigation got underway, but finding the person who committed the crime seemed an impossible task without knowing who the victim was. The man did not have any identification. A detailed description was circulated, including information about scars and his teeth, but this resulted in no leads, and the case went cold. In 2024, the Arkansas police reopened the case of the Lonoke County John Doe as a cold case. They hoped genetic genealogy could solve the mystery, and the remains were sent to a specialist facility in Texas. DNA was extracted and then compared against records from around the country. The company built a family tree for the John Doe. This gave the police a possible name: Earl James McDaniel. McDaniel had a daughter living in Washington. Her DNA allowed investigators to confirm that the John Doe was McDaniel. Earl James McDaniel had been 53 years old in 1984. Unfortunately, not much about his life was made public in the release. He lived in multiple states across the U.S., including Washington, Oklahoma, and Kansas City, Missouri. McDaniel was often in trouble with the police. In the 1960s, he'd served time in Washington, and in 1980 he was paroled in Oklahoma. His run-ins with law enforcement continued until September 11, 1984. That was the last time McDaniel is known to have been seen alive. He was arrested in Iowa for driving under the influence. Less than 2 months later, his remains would be found. Identifying Earl James McDaniel only solves part of this mystery. The man has his identity back, and his family have some answers as to what happened to him after he vanished without a trace. But there are still questions. The person who took McDaniel's life remains a mystery, as does the motive for this disturbing crime. The police continue to appeal for information. Anyone with information on this case can contact the Arkansas State Police via email at coldcase@asp.arkansas.gov. In April of 1974, a painting disappeared from a Polish museum. What started out as an intriguing mystery, which may have cost a man his life, quickly became a cold case. In February of 2025, part of the mystery was solved. The stolen painting was a small, circular piece by Peter Bruegel the Younger. It was titled "Woman Carrying the Embers" and featured a woman carrying smoldering embers in a pair of tongs in one hand and a bucket in the other. For years, it was on display in the National Museum in Poland, but on April 24, 1974, the museum staff made a horrifying discovery. A cleaner accidentally knocked the painting out of its frame, but rather than finding the original painting sitting among the shattered glass, she found a magazine photo. The painting had been stolen. The museum believed that the theft had occurred a few days earlier, on the evening of April 21st. The criminals had climbed into the building using scaffolding on the side wing of the museum. The Bruegel painting had been carefully removed from its frame and replaced with a photograph cut from a magazine. The next day, museum staff noticed the frame seemed out of place, but didn't realize anything was wrong. Witnesses reported seeing a couple cutting out a photo of the painting from a magazine at a library shortly before the theft, but appeals to track down the couple didn't provide any clues. One of the first people the police wanted to talk to was a customs officer named Romuald Werner. Romuald had gone to the authorities about concerns that the port in Gdynia was being used to illegally export art. It seemed like the missing painting may have gone that way. But just days after the theft was discovered, Romuald's lifeless body was found in a graveyard. The case was turned over to Poland's security service, but for some reason they quickly closed their investigation. With nobody investigating the disappearance, the case unsurprisingly went cold. But art sleuths continue to ponder just what happened to the small painting. Decades later, the Dutch museum Gouda was hosting an exhibition called Blazing Fires. A writer for the art magazine Vend went to view the exhibition and noticed that Woman Carrying the Embers was one of the paintings on display. According to the Dutch museum, the painting was on loan from a private collection and hadn't been seen in the public in years. Bruegel had made other copies of his painting, so it wasn't immediately clear that this was the one that had been stolen in 1974. The magazine contacted Arthur Brand for help getting to the bottom of the mystery. Brand had a reputation for locating lost and stolen paintings and was the best person to crack the case. He examined the Gouda painting and other versions of the Woman Carrying the Embers, which were on display elsewhere. The small details on the painting and writing on the back determined that this was the one that had been stolen. The painting is currently secure, and discussions are underway to return the masterpiece back to the National Museum. In 2004, hikers discovered the body of a woman in the Yorkshire Dales. It would be another 15 years before she was identified, but still the person responsible for putting her there remained a mystery. In early 2025, the case received an update for the first time since Lumdwan Armitage was identified. On September 20th, 2004, a group of hikers were attempting to summit Yorkshire's Pennigent when they stopped to snap a photo near a stream. As they looked back on the image, they realized they'd captured something unexpected in the background. It was the partially clothed remains of a young woman. The woman had been there for up to 3 weeks, making it impossible to determine how she had passed away. At first, the police believed she'd passed from natural causes, and the mystery focused on identifying the young woman. She was believed to be of Southeastern Asian descent, and a description was circulated, but this turned up no answers, and she was buried anonymously. The mysterious woman was given the name Lady of the Hills, and her case was periodically reshared in hopes of gathering new information. In 2018, the case gained more urgency. A new analysis revealed she'd not passed away naturally at all. Someone had deliberately taken her life. A new appeal for information was made, and in 2019, the Lady of the Hills was finally named. A news report had reached Thailand, where the Sikana family recognized their missing daughter. Lumdwan Armitage was a Thai woman who'd married a British man named David in 1991. They'd lived in Thailand for a while before moving to the UK and having 2 children. David worked as a teacher while Lumdwan washed dishes. According to her family, she was unhappy with her life and wanted to return home to Thailand. The last time they would ever hear from her was in 2004. David told family members that she'd returned to Thailand and married another man. This was the story their children believed, and her son traveled back to Thailand when he was getting married, hoping to invite her to the wedding. Her family had to tell him they hadn't heard from his mother since she had vanished. In 2019, DNA confirmed that the Lady of the Hills was Lumdwan Armitage. The mystery of how she ended up in the stream remained, though. David had moved back to Thailand at this point and was working as a teacher at a university. He denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, but claimed there were whispers in the Thai media saying otherwise. If he wasn't involved, British police still wanted to speak to him about the final months before Lumdwan had vanished. It was possible he knew the person responsible for the crime, even if he didn't realize it. But meetings with the police didn't go anywhere, and the case ground to a halt. Interpol issued a blue notice against David. This wasn't an arrest warrant, but simply indicated that the police wanted to obtain information from him. But this caused the Thai authorities to revoke his visa. In February of 2025, he returned to the UK. Lumdwan's family hoped this latest development would finally bring answers to their daughter's case. David was arrested by the British police, but was later released on conditional bail. David has continued to state he had no involvement in her passing, and his children have convinced him to return to the UK to clear his name. As people around the world celebrated the new year, researchers from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland published research that helped solve a mystery almost 200 years old. It began in 1831, at the tail end of the so-called Little Ice Age. Writers in Europe reported a summer that felt as cold as winter. Around the world, there were reports of the sun appearing blue, green, or even purple. Something strange was going on in the atmosphere. The temperatures dropped, rains changed, and crops failed. Over the following years, there were famines in Japan and India, but the cause of this mysterious phenomenon remained unknown. It wasn't hard for modern scientists to figure out this was the result of a catastrophic volcanic eruption somewhere on the planet. Similar things happened after more famous eruptions like that of Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. But unlike that event, there were no reports of the actual eruption. The culprit volcano remained a mystery. For a long time, scientists believed that the eruption took place somewhere in the tropics. The impact of the eruption changed the climate around the world. The ash and gases which were released into the atmosphere managed to circle the entire globe, obscuring the sun and reflecting its rays back into space. Generally, volcanoes at lower latitudes, nearer the equator, have an easier time achieving such a widespread impact. It was only with the analysis of ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica that scientists had to accept that this assumption was false. Ice cores allow scientists to look back at the atmosphere of the planets hundreds or even thousands of years ago. Particles and gases are trapped in bubbles within the ice, preserved so well that they can be analyzed all this time later. Scientists discovered that there was much more sulfur fallout in the Greenland ice cores than in the corresponding ones in Antarctica. 6.5 times more fallout, in fact. The mysterious 1831 eruption had to have taken place somewhere in the northern hemisphere, probably around the mid-latitudes. There are a few hotspots for volcanoes in the northern hemisphere. An 1831 eruption of a volcano near Sicily was suggested. The smaller volcano may have contributed to the strange atmospheric phenomenon seen in Europe, but it wasn't the main culprit. Japan seemed like the obvious answer. The country sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and countless volcanoes make up the islands. But Japan is also densely populated, with extensive records stretching back into antiquity. If a volcano had erupted as recently as 1831, there would have been a record of it. So researchers looked further north, to the Kuril Islands that stretch between Japan and Russia. Ash collected from the volcanoes in this island chain were compared to debris found in the ice cores. Only recently, advanced technology was able to do this. The ash found in Greenland has a width of only 1/10 of a diameter of the human hair and is very difficult to analyze, but the results were conclusive and shocking. The chemical makeup of ash from the 1831 cores was identical to the ash collected from the Zavaritsky volcano on Simushir Island. Researchers described it as being like a fingerprint match. They'd finally found the answer to this centuries-old mystery. In 2009, Australian police reopened the investigation into what they'd previously thought was simply a tragic incident that had claimed the life of a 25-year-old woman. In the coming years, more updates would come. The most recent update in the mystery brought some relief to her family, and the family of the man the police believed was a suspect. On the morning of July 18, 1997, Megan Louise Rose's body was discovered at the base of Point Cartwright Cliffs on Australia's Sunshine Coast. A brief investigation followed. Megan had moved to the Sunshine Coast with her boyfriend Keith Lee and his children. According to reports, she was last seen leaving her home on the night before in her car, which was located near the top of the cliffs. There were no signs of foul play, and nothing struck the police as suspicious. The case quickly closed. But Megan's family always felt like something strange had happened. They didn't believe Megan was the one responsible for her passing. For over a decade, her sister led the campaign for police to look into the case again. In 2009, she was successful. By this time, Megan's former partner was in prison for taking the life of Barry Waters in 2001. Lee had been having an affair with Waters' wife, which triggered the disturbing crime. The police discovered that Megan had a life insurance policy, and Lee was the benefactor. It'd been issued a year before she passed away, which meant he was entitled to $200,000 after her body was found. In 2009, Lee was labeled as a suspect, but the case didn't go anywhere quickly. It wouldn't be until 2023 when things began to move again. The police visited Lee at his home in Victoria to discuss the incident, but one day later, he vanished. His car was discovered abandoned in Portland, in a manner that the police believe was supposed to convince them he was no longer alive. But Lee was still very much alive. He was spotted by officers at Port Fairy, where he gave a fake name to evade capture. He would later visit a shopping center to buy new clothes before vanishing without a trace at Shepperton train station. Over the next 18 months, Lee remained hidden, but the police and those close to the case appealed for information. A $500,000 reward for information in the case was announced around the same time that Lee went missing. Lee's own child appealed for him to turn himself in to the police and to help Megan's family get answers to this mystery. They spoke to an Australian true crime podcast, which helped raise awareness of the case, and this finally led to Lee's capture. Lee's child told the media that the arrest came as a relief. Sometimes, updates in unsolved mysteries can reveal that everything previously understood about the mystery was completely false. This was the reality faced by researchers into the Ushiawa Man when they discovered the truth behind the fossils. Fossils were first discovered at a limestone quarry near Ushiawa in 1957. 2 years later, more fossils were located. These were only fragments of remains, but were relatively well preserved. Archaeologists believed these were the humerus and the femoral head, or the top of the femur of an ancient human. Analysis of the bones and the material around them dated the fossils back to around 20,000 years ago. This would make the find some of the oldest fossils in Japan, behind only the likes of the Akashi Man. Remarkably, those fossils were believed to be from around 780,000 years ago, far older than the remains found in Ushiawa. The Akashi Man fossils were destroyed during World War II, but replicas remained. Modern research into these showed that the bones actually belonged to a relatively modern human, but had accidentally been washed into a different archaeological layer. The discovery meant new analysis would take place of other fossils, including those found in Ushiawa. These remains were dated to a time more realistic for human habitation in Japan. This was during the Ice Age, when land bridges connected the country to mainland Asia. Other human fossils have also been dated back to this time period. What made the Ushiawa fossils so interesting was that scientists hadn't been able to determine what species they actually belonged to. Analysis from the 1980s suggested the fossils didn't belong to a Homo sapien, but could have been another archaic species of human. More modern research would show that the analysis was only partially correct. Researchers investigating the mysterious fossils used CT scans of the bones to form a new theory for who they had belonged to. The early researchers had left detailed descriptions behind, helping to produce detailed computer replicas. They were then compared to the fossils of known species, including brown bears and Asiatic black bears. Comparing cross-sections of the various bones showed that the Ushiawa Man was actually an ancient bear. On the morning of February 18, 1975, a young woman walking along the side of the A1 in England was struck by a vehicle. The driver didn't call for help, and the woman was left at the side of the road where she passed away. For 50 years, her identity remained a mystery. It was about 6:15 a.m. when the woman was struck, not far from the town of Baldock in Hertfordshire. Investigators couldn't determine what kind of vehicle struck her, or even how many times she'd been hit. The driver or drivers have never been identified. She was last seen alive at 5:30 a.m. when a passing motorist stopped to talk to her. The A1 is a busy road, even at that time in the morning. It was very strange to see anybody walking along it, and the motorist stopped to ask about her situation. The woman spoke with what was described as a foreign accent and said she was going to London. The two travelers went their separate ways, and the mysterious woman continued her walk down the highway. When her body was found, the police found no identification with her. She also wasn't wearing any shoes or carrying a purse. The police appealed for information, while searches along the stretch of road where she was found turned up no clues. For decades, there was no update on the case, but in 2010, a computer-generated image of the woman appeared in newspapers, along with a new appeal for information. It was then that the police got their first breakthrough. A couple named David and Barbara Liversedge spotted the face in the paper and instantly recognized it as a young woman who'd briefly lived with them 35 years earlier. The woman's name was Odile. She was a French student who the couple had first met in 1972. Odile was walking along the side of London's North Circular Road in a thunderstorm, wearing the same style of coat as the Baldock woman. David gave her a lift, and Odile ended up staying with the couple for 6 months. She eventually moved to Cambridge, where she studied at a language school. The couple couldn't be certain of the spelling, but gave investigators the name Odile Ludic, spelled L-U-D-I-C. It was a major clue, and investigators hoped the case would soon be solved, but that wouldn't be the case. Odile had told the couple about her mother and sister, but no family in France could be found. Another update in the case came in February of this year, 50 years since the mystery began. An investigator decided to search for the name Odile in Ancestry.com's newspaper archive. Immediately, a result popped up. The article was from November of 1972 and was about a house fire that took place in Cambridge. One of the residents was a woman named Odile Ledoux, a slight variation on the spelling that David Liversedge had given. Odile was 20 years old at the time of the fire and a student at the Cambridgeshire College of Arts and Technology. It's not possible to know for certain just yet if Odile is actually the Baldock woman, even though she does match the description. But anyone with information in this case can contact Locate International on 03001 021 011. Tutmos II is one of the most mysterious pharaohs of ancient Egypt. He ruled over 3,500 years ago and was largely overshadowed by his wife and son, who both succeeded him. The battle for supremacy between these two individuals further shrouded details of Tutmos II's life, leaving a lot of unanswered questions for modern archaeologists. In February of 2025, one of those questions was answered. It's extremely rare for modern archaeologists to locate the untouched tombs of ancient Egypt's rulers. Most of these were breached in ancient times by thieves who wanted to loot the luxurious artifacts the rulers had been buried with. To combat this, later rulers started moving mummies out of damaged or ransacked tombs. When it was discovered in 1881, it became known as the Royal Cache. Among the mummies buried there were Tutmos II, who'd passed away some 400 years earlier. Tutmos II was one of the earliest kings of the 18th dynasty. He took over from his father, Tutmos I, and married his half-sister Hatshepsut. Tutmos's reign was short, although historians haven't been able to determine just how short. He didn't do much during his reign, and left behind a few monuments. What monuments he did leave behind, it's believed that Hatshepsut removed his name from. His son, Tutmos III, or Tutmos the Great, tried to restore his father's name, but may have added that name to places where it didn't belong. This all caused a lot of confusion, and the discovery of Tutmos II's mummy didn't help to solve many of those mysteries. What could have solved some of those mysteries was the actual tomb where Tutmos was originally buried. This location remained one of ancient Egypt's biggest mysteries. For decades, archaeologists from around the world tried to get to the bottom of it. It was believed that he'd been buried somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, like other royals from the 18th dynasty, but searches of the valley turned up nothing. In October of 2022, a group of archaeologists were exploring an area a little way from the main necropolis. The archaeologists were exploring a different tomb cut into a cliff face when they noticed a strange entrance at the bottom of the cliff. A grand staircase going down into the earth was visible, but much of the passage was covered in debris. It would take years for the debris to be carefully cleared, but eventually the tomb could be properly explored. At first, archaeologists believed this was the burial chamber of a queen or a lesser royal. But once inside, they noticed the ceiling painted blue with yellow stars, something only found in the tombs of pharaohs. They also discovered extracts from the kingly funeral texts. Finally, they located fragments of the alabaster with Tutmos's name on it and inscriptions stating he'd been buried here by Hatshepsut. In February of 2025, they announced that this was the lost tomb of Tutmos II. But this tomb wasn't the victim of grave robbers. Instead, the tomb had been flooded. Waterfalls had once flowed over the area and partially destroyed the tomb. Tutmos had been removed not long after he was interred here. This then presented archaeologists with a new mystery. Where was Tutmos' second tomb? The team that discovered this tomb believe they may know the location of the second tomb. It's likely that it was ransacked by robbers in antiquity, but they may have left behind artifacts that could reveal more answers into the mysteries surrounding this ancient king. When art or other cultural objects are stolen, one of the biggest hopes for art fans is that they've at least made their way into the hands of people who appreciate them. Of course, the museum and fans alike would rather that they were on display for the public to see, but at the very least, they hope that the stolen items have been preserved somewhere and could one day be found. Those who held on to this hope in a series of sports memorabilia robberies that took place over the course of 2 decades were bitterly disappointed. The mystery was finally solved in February of 2025, and the items would not be coming back. In 2014, sports and art news sites alike were reporting on a strange incident which took place in Little Falls, New Jersey. The town in northern New Jersey is home to the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. It's an important center for the community, which offered children's educational programs. It also displayed a large collection of baseball memorabilia, including baseball cards, broken bats, and trophies and plaques collected by museum namesake Yogi Berra. Up until October of 2014, it also displayed 9 of Berra's 10 World Series rings. These were just some of the items stolen in a robbery. MVP plaques and other championship rings were also stolen. At the time, the police offered a reward of $5,000 for information on the crime, but that reward would never be claimed. This wasn't the first time a small museum had been hit, and it wouldn't be the last. The following year, the Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York was broken into. When the director arrived at the scene of the crime, he found that 6 championship belts from the 40s and 50s had been stolen. The glass had been smashed, and at least one of the thieves had wounded themselves in the robbery. They left behind DNA evidence that police hoped would help track down the criminal, but another 10 years would pass before the mystery was solved. A break in these cases finally came in March of 2019. Police in Pennsylvania pulled over a Pontiac, which was being driven erratically. Behind the wheel was Thomas Trotta, who was driving under the influence. He was arrested, and the police searched the rest of the car. It was then that they found all the equipment needed to rob a museum, including bolt cutters, a sledgehammer, a ski mask, and gloves. The gloves matched those worn in a 2016 incident where a snowplow was used to tear an ATM out of a wall. DNA was also collected from a cup of water Trotta drank from. It matched that left at the Boxing Hall of Fame and at multiple other museum robberies. With evidence against him mounting, Trotta decided to confess his crimes and to reveal the ring of criminals who'd helped him commit them. 4 of Trotta's accomplices pleaded guilty, but another 4 did not. Of those, 3 were found guilty in a trial, which concluded in February of 2025. The other was found not guilty. The mystery may now be solved, but sadly, most of what was stolen will never be recovered. For over 10 years, the family and friends of Una Crown were left wondering who had taken her life in a brutal and vicious attack in her home. The entire time, the person responsible for the mystery was still living in the community. It would take advancements in DNA technology for the case to finally be solved. It was Monday, January 13th, when Una's body was found in her front hall. Una was 86 years old at the time and lived alone in her bungalow in England. She didn't like to let other people into her house. Even when her niece Judy and Judy's husband John took her grocery shopping, Una didn't let them bring the bags past her front doorstep. Twice a week, Judy and John would take Una on outings. Una would always be waiting by the front door for them and was ready to leave as soon as they arrived. So it was very odd when they arrived that morning and Una didn't answer the door. They tried contacting her landline, but the phone was busy. Eventually, John found a neighbor who had a spare key and gained access to the house. He came across a strange and disturbing scene. There had been multiple small fires in the house, and some of Una's clothing had been set alight. These had all been put out by the time John arrived. When he found Una, she had a wound to her neck, which had ultimately claimed her life, and the landline was left off the hook. When the police arrived, they believed this had been a tragic accident. One of the rings on Una's stove malfunctioned and remained hot when turned off. The police believed this had caused the fire, and a scarf wrapped too tightly had caused wounds to her neck. When a local fire commander told the police that the scene needed to be secured, they insisted that nothing suspicious had happened. Unfortunately, this meant many people disturbed the crime scene over the following days, possibly destroying important evidence. A few days later, a pathologist discovered that Una had more extensive wounds. She'd been attacked by a bladed object, and the mystery was definitely a case of foul play. The police conducted house-to-house interviews, and one of the people they spoke to in the weeks after the crime was a neighbor named David Newton. He was a handyman who'd done work for Una in the past, but insisted he hadn't seen her on the day of the attack. Newton was immediately a suspect. He had a reputation for strange behavior, especially when he'd been drinking, and made other people in the neighborhood uncomfortable. He was arrested at one point, but the police did not have enough evidence to charge him with anything, and he was released. What evidence the police did find at the crime scene was hard to use. Everything was covered in Una's DNA, and it was difficult to find usable traces of anything else within that. As technology advanced, though, this problem could be solved. Experts found traces of male DNA on Una's nail clippings. With this, they went back to old suspects, including Newton. A new sample was taken, and it was revealed to be a match. Newton had been at the crime scene. Newton was arrested again, and his trial took place in early 2025. During the trial, it emerged that Newton had a small amount of money from Una's purse, which he spent at an ex-serviceman's club over the weekend. But robbery wasn't the main motive for the crime. There didn't appear to be any motive at all. Newton pleaded not guilty, but did not speak in the trial. He was found guilty of the crime and was handed a life sentence. The USS Harder was among other notable war vessels that achieved legendary status in the U.S. Navy submarine force. The submersible, captained by Commander Samuel D. Dealey, was credited with the sinking of 6 Japanese destroyers, 2 frigates, and 20.5 freighters, earning it the nickname Hit 'em Harder. Post-war analysis revealed that this is the most warships sunk by a single vessel in U.S. Navy history. But there was something else latching on to the USS Harder's history. Described as the deadliest World War II sub, the vessel would engage in strenuous battles, which would ultimately lead to its demise. The sub had already been in 5 war patrols, defending America and coming out on the other end unharmed. That was until the 24th of August in 1944, when the vessel, with its 78 crew members and Captain Dealey, headed out into the South China Sea off Luzon. It was the submarine's 6th war patrol, and that morning it would be engaged in a destructive battle with the Japanese escort ship CD-22. Harder fired 3 torpedoes at its combatant, but the ship evaded all of them and began a series of depth charge attacks. The 5th charge struck the U.S. Navy ship, sinking it and the crew on board. Just after noon that day, another sub, the USS Hake, who was close by the attack site, headed to the area and began to sweep it at periscope depth in search of the missing craft. Hake, though, only found a ring marker of buoys covering a 1/2-mile radius. On the 2nd of January the following year, the Navy declared that the sub was presumed lost, and its name was subsequently taken off the Navy register. The USS Harder was gone, sunken into the abyss, never to be seen again. Until now. You'd think that after so many years, most would have given up searching for the doomed vessel. But through advanced technology, new developments, and renewed search efforts, these daunting old maritime mysteries can finally be updated and placed in the solved archives. The effort known as the Lost 52 Project has been dedicated to finding lost World War II vessels. The group works to not only find the missing submarines, but also to memorialize them. Specifically, Lost 52 has been working on finding the 52 submarines that went missing during the war, and so far they've located a few of them. After discovering fallen subs such as Greyback, Stickleback, R-12, and Grunion, the team began doing some research into Harder. After studying various reports and documents, the team would find themselves scouring the South China Sea, armed with radars, sonar equipment, and ROVs, floating over the area where the sub was last seen. The crew made use of the shipboard sonar that revealed objects on the seafloor. They also deployed AUVs, which can dive deeper than human divers. Even though such advanced steps were taken, it was still like a needle in a haystack. With their AUV, though, Lost 52 discovered an unidentified sunken sub that they believed may be the deadliest war submarine in history. The vessel was sitting upright on its keel and appeared relatively intact at a depth of over 3,000 feet. The conning tower, though, had suffered significant damage and appears to be the result of a depth charge. Confident that this was the vessel they'd been searching for, Lost 52, along with Naval History and Heritage Command, confirmed that this was the Harder, and after 80 years, its resting place was finally revealed. It was 2016 when 20-year-old Erica Nicole Hunt was making changes to her life. She was talking about her 21st birthday and how she'd be applying for public housing soon. It appeared that life was going well for her, and her eyes were set on a bright future ahead. That year, she would attend her uncle's 4th of July celebration, which took place on the 3rd. She and her young daughter were having a good time, and Erica was discussing her future plans. That day, she also told her mother, Shannon, that she had plans to go to Lake Charles the following day. But unfortunately, Erica didn't stick to those plans. The following morning, she would make a brief visit to the home where her sister and brother-in-law were living. She borrowed a bit of money from them and left soon after. Oddly, she didn't even ask them for a ride, which the family stated she usually did. Shortly after departing her sister's home, Erica would enigmatically disappear, prompting a lengthy search, investigation, and mystery. No one saw which way she walked off or if someone picked her up. The young woman was simply gone. Later reports placed Erica's last confirmed sightings to be behind Ray Boudin's around 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. that day. 2 days went by with still no sign of the missing 20-year-old. Erica's family headed to the police station and filed a missing person report. According to Erica's brother-in-law, who was one of the last people to see her, police didn't interview him until a month later. He stated, quote, "They thought it was over. It was solved before they even started." The police department never responded to that claim, and many believe they'd written off the disappearance. Erica was an adult after all. With little effort in the form of physical searches, it seems that all hopes of finding her were lost. But Shannon wasn't going to give up that easily. For weeks, her search continued, but those quickly turned into months. It wasn't until years later that there was a break in the case, but it wasn't the one we were hoping for. On the 18th of December in 2018, the remains of a Jane Doe were found in Ville Platte, Louisiana, during the search for a missing minor. The partial remains of the Jane Doe would be left in the laboratory for another 3 years until they were finally identified. The Jane Doe was Erica Nicole Hunt, and an inquisition into her demise began. The disappearance was now a homicide investigation. But despite this newfound information, police were still scratching their heads with no suspects in mind. Then, on the 21st of November, 2024, 8 years after her disappearance, investigators arrested Jordan Barnes, Erica's brother-in-law. He'd confessed to taking the young woman's life and was charged with second-degree homicide. This was the only bit of information publicly released regarding the arrest. No one knows his motive behind the slaying, or what prompted him to make this confession now, so many years after having committed the crime. Still, the investigation into the untimely demise of Erica is ongoing, as police try to piece together the means and motive behind such a horrendous act. Looming over southern Italy's landscape is Mount Vesuvius, the stratovolcano that caused one of the most well-known natural disasters, the Pompeii disaster. In 79 CE, it emptied its bowels, entombing the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, destroying everything in its path and reducing it all to ash. For over 32 agonizing hours, the harrowing eruption unfolded, raining debris in the first half and releasing a scalding flow of gas in the second. Through eyewitness accounts in various ancient documents, the timeline of the eruption was pieced together, and through other archaeological efforts, something else would be discovered. Starting from the mid-18th century, a miraculous result of the disaster began to emerge. It was the preserved remnants of the volcano's victims, still bracing themselves in curled-up positions, shielding a loved one or trying to flee, their agony forever frozen in time. Since the emergence of the first casts, more excavations have been made, some of which are haunting, heartbreaking, and grave. Archaeologists have excavated ashen casts of victims lying side by side or hugging for the last time. The space where these citizens decomposed has opened a world of imagination, with questions of who these victims were and what their connections may have been to one another. Experts began to piece together their stories. The immortalized casts inspired narratives that could explain why two figures are seen holding one another, or why another was wearing a golden bracelet and met her demise while shielding a smaller victim. They only guessed that the two figures were sisters hugging one last time, and that the mother was shielding her toddler, making way for a sorrowful concept. But in the great question of who these victims were, it seemed that the answer was most erroneous. In 2024, a team led by scientists at Harvard Medical School, the University of Florence, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sought to determine the truth behind these figures. They collected and analyzed the DNA of 5 victims and made use of new DNA testing and evidence. And their findings ultimately destroyed those assumed narratives, but also brought new questions to light. This new evidence has upended the stories of the ancient people, their lives, and their relationships with their neighbors who perished with them. The group of 4 Pompeians were thought to be parents and their children, but it turned out they actually had no biological relationship. The 2 sisters holding one another also share no relation, and one of them is believed to be male. The mother and child were actually that of a man and a biologically unrelated infant. With such discoveries, archaeologists are forced to re-examine the identities of the preserved plaster-filled voids. This newfound evidence challenges the notions of associations of jewelry with femininity, or the interpretation of physical proximities to a familial connection. The experts and researchers vow not to make such mistakes based on these corrections, and we're once again left with the question, who are the victims of the Pompeii volcanic disaster? It was the early months of 2024 when Veronica Butler and Jillian Kelly would make a trip that they would never return from. Jillian, a mother of 4, was married to the former pastor of Hugoton First Christian Church. She worked as a secretary there and ran the children's program. She was acquainted with Veronica, who was also a member of the same church. At this time, she was in a custody battle over her 2 children with her ex-partner. The 30th of March would be the day that her friends would make their 16-mile-long trip from Elkhart, Kansas to Ava, Oklahoma. Veronica's son and daughter were in Ava, staying at their grandmother's house. The 2 women were supposed to pick the children up and bring them back to Hugoton, Kansas, where they lived. This was in celebration of the daughter's birthday. But the birthday party would never take place, and the trip came to an abrupt stop 3 miles from the destination. Veronica and Jillian never arrived in Ava and haven't been heard from again. It didn't take long for the blue Kia SUV that they were driving to be located, and it had been abandoned on the roadside near Highway I-95 and Road L in Texas County, a rural area around 3 miles away from Ava. Almost immediately, it was deduced that this disappearance involved foul play. Detectives were able to make this decision based on what they uncovered inside the vehicle. But at first they didn't want to reveal what evidence was found, given that it was an ongoing investigation. But even though trace evidence was found, it appeared that the trail ended at the abandoned car. 1 week went by with seemingly no progress in this harrowing disappearance. There were no sightings of the 2 missing women, and no tips that may lead to their whereabouts. Veronica and Jillian were simply gone. Then on the 14th of April, there was a break in the case. Buried on a farming property in a hole filled with dirt and concrete were 2 unidentified bodies stashed in a chest freezer. Police quickly got to work on identifying them and managed to positively name the remains as the missing 27-year-old Veronica Butler and 39-year-old Jillian Kelly. Soon, the rest of the puzzle began falling into place. It turned out that the farming property allegedly had ties to 54-year-old Tiffany Adams, the grandmother of Veronica's children. It was a grazing pasture that she would rent and have access to all the time. Following this connection, a series of search warrants were filed, and 5 suspects were placed in handcuffs. Each of the 5 is being accused of being part of a larger-scale, complex, and grisly homicidal scheme supposedly devised by an anti-government organization. According to court documents, it was alleged that this scheme was meant to end the strenuous custody battle. The investigation didn't end there either. Another suspect among the five was 43-year-old Tad Cullum, who asked the pasture owner if he could remove a tree to bury some concrete that had been piled up near the dam and it was sitting above ground. The property owner approved the project and Cullum undertook it the next day. Two other suspects were Cole and Cora Twombly, who were also part of the anti-government organization. The group had allegedly tried to end Veronica's life previously but was unsuccessful. According to one witness regarding the plot, Cora would often speak openly about how the homicide would unfold. The witness stated that Cora had mentioned plans to end Veronica's life, claiming she would throw an anvil through her window. Among this harrowing plot and grisly intentions were also the mentions of threats, of which several recordings were obtained. Adams and Cullum had been the ones making the alleged threats amid the child custody case. The group was said to convene regularly at the Twombly home, where they would discuss their homicide plot before eventually carrying it out. Each of the five are being charged with 2 counts of first degree, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of conspiracy. It was May of 2022 when a land survey was underway in a wooded area located behind a National Guard armory in Wadesboro, Anson County, North Carolina. But the survey would uncover something beyond what experts expected. Skeletal remains jutted from the dirt. The significantly decomposed remains were that of a person. Due to the state of the remains, not much was able to be deduced. All that was known was that this was a female between the ages of 20 and 40 who wore black leggings. Dubbed the Anson County Jane Doe, the remains were transported to a lab for further identification, but those results would not come for quite some time. In the interim, investigators began looking for more clues, and they certainly found them not too far away. A clue came in the form of a trail camera that revealed something daunting. Images from the camera dated back to the 22nd of August in 2022, between 1:30 and 4:30 a.m. Seen moving around in the line of sight was a woman matching the Jane Doe's brief description. The individual was carrying a stick and walking around the area, which appeared to be a deer feeder. The stick was being used as a sort of walking stick, suggesting an injury. Many believe that the woman seen in the footage is the Anson County Jane Doe, who turned up deceased months later. Not long after this discovery, rabbit hunters also found something potentially crucial. It was a backpack, possibly belonging to the Jane Doe. But they allegedly tampered with it and removed some cash before leaving it behind. Social media latched onto the story, as many online sleuths began attempting to piece the puzzle together. Investigators were scratching their heads and began to look into unsolved disappearances from that area. Amateur sleuths did the same, and they wound up with 2 likely candidates in 2024. One of them was April Michelle Reed, who disappeared in March of 2021, last sighted in Hickory, North Carolina. April's age of 36 placed her within the assumed age range of the Jane Doe. Her height and weight, 5'5" and 110 pounds, also fit the description. It was suggested in her case that she was heading towards the Myrtle Beach area, traveling by road or hitchhiking. The second candidate was a woman named Amber Ray Johnston, who was also 36 years old when she disappeared. She's described as being 5'6" and weighing around 150 pounds. Amber was also believed to be heading toward Myrtle Beach by the Winston-Salem Greyhound bus. The woman was said to have lived a nomadic lifestyle and had broken up with her partner in 2021 and disappeared in mid-August. Following extensive search efforts, she was never located. When Amber initially went missing, her family would submit samples of their DNA in case identification was needed. Even with potential victims narrowed down to just 2, the mystery was not over. A new detective was appointed in charge of the Anson County Jane Doe case, which paved the way for forward movement in identifying her. In 2024, the images from the trail camera were publicly released, and soon tips on both Amber and April began to pour in. Despite new information and potential evidence, apprehension remained as the DNA results still hadn't been finalized. From the discovery in 2022 to the late months of 2024, there was still no answer in the case of the Anson County Jane Doe. That was until earlier this year. The DNA results were back. The mystery of the identity of the Jane Doe could finally be put to rest. The remains belonged to Amber Ray Johnson, who disappeared from the Greyhound bus in August of 2021. While the Bullhead City, Arizona resident was finally found, questions still linger regarding the circumstances of her disappearance and her obscure demise. Why is there sea plankton growing on the International Space Station? This is a question that has been pondered since August of 2014, when Russian cosmonauts claimed to have made a rather intriguing discovery. They were stationed on the International Space Station when they made their unbelievable and incredibly confident claim. The cosmonauts had taken samples from the exterior of the ISS, where they noted something mysterious growing. Their mission was nothing more than a routine spacewalk that turned into something strange. The surface samples would be taken to a team of scientists with access to high-precision equipment. Through the so-called test experiment, experts discovered that these organisms showed hints of marine plankton, as well as other forms of microbial life. It seemed that this mystery plankton had latched itself to the surface of the illuminators. In fact, it appeared that it had been thriving there for some years already. Experts even claimed that the plankton suggested a phase of development consistent with that found on the surface of the ocean. Through further research and experiments in the last 3 years, it was soon deduced that this form of life may be able to live outside of an earthly environment. Despite the hostile conditions in space, it's been suggested that these organisms possessed the ability to live there. To prove the suggestions, scientists demonstrated that the plankton could even live in the vacuums of space. While explaining how the plankton was able to survive on the ISS, there was still one problem though. How did it get there? The plankton is not found near the launch site. The life form just didn't fit the characteristics of the area where the ISS crew and cargo are launched from. So experts had to settle on an alternative idea: the wind. It turned out that the rise of air currents settled on the Earth's surface of the International Space Station. Strong wind essentially lofts up plankton into the Earth's atmosphere, and gravity pulls them into space, allowing them to latch onto the satellite. But NASA disagreed with this explanation, and even today the squabbles continue. The discovery of the plankton and the alleged unknown bacteria remain a point of mystery and fascination today. Studies are underway, and the residents are left with anticipation as they await the answer to whether or not there is earthly life growing on the exterior of the International Space Station. Aviation mysteries aren't just a thing of the past. There are a number of flying and sailing vehicles that enigmatically vanish on a regular basis. But even with our improved search methods and equipment, these disappearances remain incredibly daunting. The most recent enduring aviation mystery was the vanishing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 360. It was the 8th of March in 2014 when the craft took off from Kuala Lumpur around 12:41 a.m., with its destination intended for Beijing. The airplane, a Boeing 777, was filled with 227 passengers and 12 crew members who never would have expected to become part of an extensive search and unsolvable mystery. During the flight, MH270 reached an altitude of 35,000 feet moments after takeoff. The aircraft communication addressing and reporting system transmitted the report confirming that the craft had ascended at 1:01 a.m. But by 1:07 a.m., the last transmission was sent and subsequently switched off. This marked the very start of what would become a daunting aviation mystery. The last voice communication was documented at 1:19 that morning, and at 1:21, the transponder was switched off too, a moment that marked its entry into the Vietnamese airspace over the South China Sea. Just moments after that, a Malaysian military radar managed to pick up the plane, reporting that it seemed to have turned around and was now flying southwest over the Malay Peninsula. Less than an hour later, that radar had lost contact with the plane, which was now above the Andaman Sea. But a satellite would continue to receive signals from MH370 for hours. It was last detected around 8 a.m. that morning. This would be the last time that any signal or communication would come from that flight. The craft was now missing, along with its passengers. Search efforts initially focused on the wrong place, the South China Sea. Even though the efforts were later moved to other areas of the ocean, there was still no sign of the missing vessel. Days turned into weeks and weeks to months. Sparking new hope in the search efforts was the detection of several acoustic pings that began on the 6th of April, believed to be coming from the Boeing 777's black box, 1,200 miles from Perth, Western Australia. Aside from the occasional clue, any efforts to find the missing MH370 proved futile, and the search was soon abandoned. The aircraft became just another unfortunate tragedy that seemed to draw parallels from a horror sci-fi. And just when all hope was lost, all efforts were abandoned. Well, in 2014, a startling claim renewed the efforts in the search for the missing MH370. In May of last year, an astounding allegation flooded social media and news sites. A UK-based expert claimed to have found the missing craft wrecked in the depths of the Cambodian jungle. Ian Wilson's bizarre claim suggested that by using Google Maps, he came across a supposedly unidentified wreckage that flattened trees, making a clearing in the jungle. The claim made by Wilson can be traced back to 2018, but his report lacked support from any official statements. In fact, further investigation into the claim discovered that the wreckage in the Cambodian jungle had actually been there since 2004. Even though Wilson's claim seemed to be a misjudgment, it was his satellite search that prompted renewed MH370 search efforts in March. A Texas-based company, Ocean Infinity, was inspired by this sudden and bizarre suggestion and proposed a new search of the southern Indian Ocean, the area where the plane is believed to have crashed. The company submitted a no-cure, no-fee proposal to the Malaysian government and began their hunt for the disappearing craft. These efforts prompted new discoveries and new claims. One scientist, Vincent Lin, suggested the perfect hiding place where one may find the missing Malaysian flight. The adjunct researcher referred to supposed evidence that the plane had deliberately flown into a 20,000-foot deep hold located in the Indian Ocean's Broken Ridge. Broken Ridge is a rugged environment, stewed with narrow sides, massive ridges, and other deep holes. But now, experts only need to investigate this theory when the season comes around again, and hopefully with renewed insight into one of the world's greatest aviation mysteries, a solution can finally be found. Measuring 195 feet and weighing 735 tons was the Adela Shores, the wooden steamship. The vessel would transport various types of cargo across Lake Superior, the graveyard of ships. Little did anyone know back in 1909 that this very vessel would become associated with mysteries surrounding the lake that swallowed ships whole. It was the 29th of April that year when the Adela Shores left the dock following the steel steamship Daniel J. Muriel, bound for Duluth with 9,200 barrels of salt aboard. But the wooden vessel would never make it to its destination. Instead, it would become just another of the many names in the list of maritime mysteries. An icy gale off Whitefish Point, Michigan, ensured that Adela Shores would disappear and become one of the lake's unsolved mysteries. As it plowed through the icy water surface, it seemed to founder off of Whitefish Point, leading the captain of the Muriel to speculate that it had been an ice floe, puncturing its hull and ultimately sinking the ship. This guess, though, couldn't be confirmed if there wasn't wreckage to be found, and despite desperate searches for the vessel and its crew, the Adela Shores remained missing. No debris ever washed ashore, and the salt just dissolved in the depths. Other inbound ships reported no sightings of the missing vessel, except for the steamer Glenella, which supposedly ran through drifting wreckage near Sable Point, west of where the ship had last been seen. The crew of the Simon Lingell also reported floating debris, including that of painted and tarred deck planks. The captain of the Simon Lingell was confident that the pieces belonged to the vessel that had vanished in Lake Superior, but the location of the Adela Shores would remain an enduring mystery for years to come. 112 years to be exact. In the summer of 2021, Earl, the director of marine operations for the Historical Society, teamed up with his brother Dan. The two headed out onto the graveyard of ships equipped with trusty side-scan sonar systems. The system revealed something strange in the distance. Eerie sonar shadows were cast across the lake bed. Its shapes looked very mast-like, and a rigging was seen too. There was no doubt that the imagery revealed the distinct shape of a ship. Knowing that there were many missing vessels in the vastness of Lake Superior, the brothers sent down their ROV to get a closer look at what the systems had found. Daryl knew almost instantly, based on the wreck's length, that they were looking at the ill-fated Adela shores that had disappeared over 100 years earlier. The ship had made its final resting place 40 miles away from Whitefish Point, where it was last seen, and now it was submerged in 650 feet of water and was teeming with marine life. But it was well preserved and 100% confirmed to be Adela Shores, allowing its name to finally be taken off the list of unsolved ship disappearances. It's always been the most unfathomable question, one that has plagued the minds of all for decades, a mystery that endures. Is there life beyond Earth? For ages, we've wondered if there are other planets out there that can sustain earthly life. We've sent countless spaceships and rovers to other floating rocks, hoping to find just a hint of plant life, a stream of water, or just a molecule that may indicate that Earth isn't the only one that can support life. Over the years, leading experts have discovered many things about the planets within our solar system, suggesting that some of them may have once been able to host life. Despite its extremely hot habitat and runaway greenhouse effect, some researchers found evidence that suggests liquid water was once present on Venus. Mars gained intense interest when similar conditions were discovered there. Researchers allegedly found traces of liquid water, indicating past water features. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, is believed to have had a subsurface ocean, and Titan has a thick atmosphere containing liquid methane and ethane, the potential habitat for unique life forms. Despite these discoveries, the quest for answers to the mystery of whether planets are habitable has only recently, in 2025, seen legitimate evidence of potential signs of life. Not present in our solar system, 729 trillion miles away, there floats an exoplanet orbiting a red dwarf star, twice the size of Earth. K218b, the distant planet with which we share the Milky Way, became a point of study among a research team led by Cambridge University. The team had been conducting repeat analysis on K218b using the James Webb Space Telescope when they discovered something that seemed nearly impossible. It was the chemical fingerprints that on Earth are used to produce microbial life, algae, seaweed, and marine phytoplankton. The discovery raises the possibility of the presence of a warm ocean on a planet 124 light-years away. It was certainly a groundbreaking find, one that's regarded as the strongest evidence yet that there may be life on a planet outside of our home planet. The 6th of May, 2014, a day marred by a chilling and unexpected event that took place in Lake Oconee, Georgia. 88-year-old Russell Dermott and his wife, 87-year-old Shirley, were expected to show up at a local Kentucky Derby party, but they never arrived there. Instead, the pair were undergoing an assault that would leave them both deceased. Concerned, a neighbor headed to the home and discovered a harrowing sight. On the floor of the two-car garage was the lifeless body of Russell, lying in a pool of vital fluid, and his head was missing. At first, Shirley was nowhere to be seen, leading police to assume that she'd been kidnapped while her husband was attacked. Searches ensued for not only the missing resident, but also her husband's head. Hoping that Shirley was still alive, investigators organized search parties and scoured the surrounding areas to no avail. It was only 10 days later that her body was discovered. She'd been submerged in Lake Oconee, weighed down by concrete blocks. But the discovery was made so far out into the lake that it suggested a boat may have been used in the attack. Upon retrieving the remains, experts found that she'd sustained 3 blows to the head with a blunt object. A homicide investigation was opened, but very little headway was made in identifying a suspect or a motive. The last time anyone had seen the Dermans was 5 days earlier, on the 1st of May. Russell was said to have been running some errands nearby in Eatonton. The pair also spoke with one of their children, Brad, later that same day. Investigators soon discovered that they had no true leads or evidence in this brutal scene, and were forced to pursue mere guesses instead. One of those theories that they pursued related to a 2000 homicide case, the victim being their son, Mark. The theory, though, was quickly discarded as no significant connections were made. this was the case with other leading theories too. The crime enacted upon the couple didn't seem random, but who would want to hurt them? The nature of the unsolved homicide was shocking. The Putnam County Sheriff, Howard Sills, suggested that many people may have been involved in the ordeal. The department also theorized that Russell's missing head may be the key to unlocking this mystery. It's believed that the criminal had taken the head because he couldn't retrieve the lead that was used in the homicide. The residue present on the collar of Russell's shirt corroborated this idea, but still no evidence led to any named suspects and no definitive motive could be ascertained. Through further efforts, the mystery has taken a step closer to being solved. In May of 2024, new DNA evidence and technology led to a break in the case. Several months previously, Putnam County Police had sent Russell's shirt to Othram Labs and Sorensen Forensics. Both fields located trace evidence, DNA, that belonged to an unknown individual. The DNA was confirmed not to be from Russell or Shirley. As of 2025, no identification of a potential suspect has been released. The most disturbing part of all is that Russell's head remains undiscovered to this day. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.